Take the watch. My father's lawyer pushed the small wooden box across the table toward me. I stared at it. The box was scratched along one corner, the brass latch barely holding together. Inside was the cheapest-looking watch I had ever seen. The hands had stopped at $2.17. Across the table, my younger brother Daniel leaned back in his chair and smiled. He had just inherited nearly $18 million. I had inherited a broken watch. Daniel looked at me and gave a quiet laugh. Dad always knew who was responsible with money. I didn't answer him. I picked up the watch. It was heavier than it looked. And for reasons I couldn't explain, my father's final words came back to me. Don't let Daniel know what the watch means. At the time, I thought those words were just the confused rambling of a dying man. 3 weeks later, I would discover that my father hadn't been confused at all. He had been preparing me. You're watching Father's Hidden Reckoning, where we tell stories about family, betrayal, consequences, and the moments when people finally discover what they are worth. Your support truly means a lot to us. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from today. Drop your city or country in the comments. This is a fictionalized story created for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarities to real people, names, places, or events are purely coincidental. Now let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 52 years old, and for most of my life, I was the son nobody noticed. Not because I was unloved. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. My father, Richard Carter, had built a successful commercial construction company outside Columbus, Ohio. He started with one pickup truck, a toolbox, and a habit of working until his hands bled. By the time he retired, Carter Development owned warehouses, office buildings, and several commercial properties. People who met him later in life assumed he'd been born wealthy. They never saw the man he used to be. I did. I was 12 when he took me to my first construction site. The air smelled like wet concrete and diesel fuel. I remember standing beside him in an oversized yellow helmet while workers moved steel beams across the unfinished floor. My father pointed toward the building. Anyone can inherit something, he told me. Building something is different. I remember that sentence for 40 years. Daniel never did. My younger brother was 5 years behind me. Where I was quiet, Daniel was charming. Where I saved money, Daniel spent it. Where I planned, Daniel gambled. And where I saw my father's company as something that had taken decades to build, Daniel saw it as something waiting for him. Dad rarely criticized him. That was one of the things that always bothered me. When Daniel wrecked his first sports car at 23, Dad paid for the repairs. When Daniel opened a restaurant that lasted 11 months, Dad absorbed the debt. When Daniel convinced Dad to invest in a luxury apartment project that never got off the ground, Dad lost almost $2 million. And every time I asked my father why he kept rescuing him, Dad gave me the same answer. He's your brother. I would usually say nothing, because I knew there was another answer hiding behind those 3 words, one that my father wasn't ready to give me. I chose a different life. After college, I worked for a smaller construction firm. I eventually started my own remodeling company and spent 26 years building it from the ground up. It wasn't glamorous. I didn't drive an expensive car. I didn't belong to country clubs. I lived in the same modest house I'd bought when I was 29. My wife, Sarah, used to joke that our neighbors probably thought I was allergic to luxury. But I liked my life. There was something comforting about knowing exactly where everything came from. Every dollar. Every wall. Every mistake. Then Sarah died. That was 4 years before my father passed away. After she was gone, the house became painfully quiet. Her coffee mug remained on the kitchen shelf for months. Not because I couldn't move it, because moving it felt like admitting she wasn't coming back. My father was one of the few people who understood that kind of silence. He started calling me every Sunday evening. Sometimes we talked for an hour, sometimes 5 minutes. Sometimes he didn't have anything to say. He'd just ask, "You eating?" And I'd say yes. Then he'd ask, "Sleeping?" I'd lie and say, "Yes." Those calls became our routine. Daniel rarely called. But whenever he did, it was usually because he wanted something alone. An introduction. A favor. A signature. Or access to Dad. Then about 8 months before my father's death, something changed. Dad stopped talking about the company. Instead, he started asking strange questions. Do you still keep Sarah's old documents? Where do you keep your important papers? Have you ever made a list of everything you own? I laughed the first time. Dad, are you planning to rob me? He didn't laugh. He looked at me across the kitchen table. No. Then he lowered his voice. I'm trying to make sure nobody else does. I remember the exact sound of the refrigerator running behind us. I remember the rain tapping against the window. And I remember thinking that my father looked older than he had the week before. What are you talking about? He shook his head. Not yet. Not yet what? You'll know when you need to. I thought it was about his health. I asked him if there was something wrong. He said no. He was lying. I just didn't know what the lie was protecting. 2 months later, he called me late at night. It was 11:43. My father's name appeared on my phone. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. Dad, nothing. Dad, I heard him breathing. Then he said something that made me sit upright. Michael, if Daniel asks you for the watch, don't give it to him. I stared into the darkness. What watch? There was a long pause. The one on my desk. What does that mean? You'll find it. Dad, what's going on? Another pause. Then his voice became unusually firm. Promise me. I didn't understand. But something in his voice frightened me. I promise. He exhaled. Good. Then he hung up. I called back immediately. He didn't answer. The next morning, I drove to his house. He was sitting in his office, wearing a gray sweater, reading the newspaper as if nothing had happened. I stood in the doorway. You scared me last night. He looked up. I do that sometimes. You told me not to give Daniel a watch. His expression changed, only slightly. But I saw it. You remember that? Of course I remember. He folded the newspaper. Then forget we talked about it. Dad. Michael. He looked directly into my eyes. Some things are safer when you don't understand them too early. That sentence stayed with me. But I let it go. I had spent my entire life believing my father's secrets belonged to him. I didn't realize one of those secrets was about to become mine. 6 weeks later, Richard Carter died in his sleep. No dramatic final words. No hospital room. No chance for goodbye. Just a phone call at 6:18 in the morning from the nursing aide who had found him. I drove to his house without remembering half the trip. Daniel arrived 20 minutes after me. He walked into the living room, looked at me, and hugged me. For a moment, he seemed genuinely broken. Then he whispered something into my ear. Do you know what Dad left me? I pulled away. What? Daniel smiled through wet eyes. Everything. I thought grief was making him confused. It wasn't. He already knew. 3 days later, we sat inside the conference room of Dad's attorney. There were 4 people around the table. The attorney, his assistant, Daniel, and me. My father's estate was worth more than I had imagined. Cash accounts, commercial properties, investment portfolios, company shares, a vacation property in Florida, and several buildings I didn't even know he owned. The attorney read the allocations carefully. Daniel received the controlling interest in Carter Development, most of the investment accounts, the Florida property, 2 commercial buildings, and approximately $18 million in assets. I received my father's personal home, a modest amount of cash, several sentimental possessions, and a wooden box. Daniel laughed when a lawyer placed it in front of me. That it? The attorney looked uncomfortable. That is what your father specified. Daniel leaned back. Michael gets the watch. I opened the box. There it was. A scratched old wristwatch with a cracked leather strap. The second hand wasn't moving. 217. I turned it over. There was an inscription on the back. 3 words. Build. Don't beg. My father's handwriting. I swallowed. Daniel leaned across the table. Dad really knew how to make a joke. I closed the box. The attorney continued reading. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about that phone call. Don't let Daniel know what the watch means. I looked at my brother. He was smiling. But there was something strange about that smile. Not sadness. Not grief. Relief. And suddenly I wondered why. Why had my father given Daniel almost everything? Why had he left me a broken watch? And why had he warned me specifically about my own brother? I didn't ask those questions that day. I took the watch home. I placed it on my kitchen table. And for 3 nights, I couldn't stop looking at it. On the 4th night, I noticed something I had missed before. The back of the watch wasn't sealed properly. There was a tiny gap beneath the metal plate. I found a screwdriver. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside wasn't a battery. There was no mechanism. No gears. No spring. Instead, there was a tiny folded piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. Only 6 words were written on it. Check the time. Not the watch. I read it twice. Then a 3rd time. And suddenly, I understood why my father had stopped the hands at 2:17. It wasn't the watch that mattered. It was the time. I opened my laptop. I searched my father's old emails. Then his calendar. Then his business records. Nothing. I almost gave up. Until I remembered something he'd said years earlier. A sentence I hadn't thought about since I was 30. He had been standing beside an unfinished warehouse when he pointed at the concrete foundation and said, "Numbers tell you where the body is buried." At the time, I thought he was talking about construction. Now I wasn't so sure. I went through every document I had from the estate. Invoices. Property records. Tax statements. Old contracts. Bank correspondence. At 1:32 in the morning, I found it. A transaction dated 8 years earlier. 2:17 p.m. The amount was $1,750,000. The recipient was a company I'd never heard of. Redstone Holdings, LLC. I stared at the screen. Then I looked at the watch. 2:17. My father hadn't left me a broken watch. He had left me a question. And someone had spent years making sure I never knew the answer. The next morning, I called Daniel. He answered on the 2nd ring. His voice was different now. Cold. Businesslike. I found something in Dad's records. Silence. Then he asked, "What did you find?" I didn't answer. And for the first time since my father died, I heard fear in my brother's voice. That was when I knew the $18 million hadn't been the inheritance. It had been the bait. And I had just found the first thread connecting my father's final secret to everything Daniel had been hiding. I didn't tell my brother what I had discovered. Not yet. Instead, I put the watch back in its box, and I began pulling on the thread. I didn't tell my brother what I had discovered. Not yet. Instead, I put the watch back in its box, and I began pulling on the thread. The first thing I did was search Redstone Holdings. The company existed. Barely. Its registered address was a small office building in Delaware. Its listed manager was a man named Victor Hale. I recognized the name. Victor had been one of Dad's financial consultants during the final decade of his life. I called him. He didn't answer. I left a message. 2 hours later, he called me back. "Michael." His voice was tired. "You've been looking at Redstone." It wasn't a question. "Yes." There was a long silence. "Your father told me you might." My grip tightened around the phone. "What did he tell you?" "What?" "Not over the phone. We met that afternoon in a quiet coffee shop 20 minutes outside town." Victor arrived carrying a brown leather folder. He looked older than I remembered. He sat down across from me. "Before I show you anything," he said, "I need you to understand something." "What?" "Your father didn't trust the people around him." "Who?" Victor looked directly at me. "Mostly your brother." My stomach tightened. "Why?" "Because Daniel had been taking money from Carter Development for years." I shook my head. "Dad knew." He knew enough. Victor opened the folder. Inside were copies of bank transfers. Not one. Not five. Dozens. Small amounts at first. $8,000. $14,500. $27,000. Then larger ones. $90,000. $140,000. $300,000. All routed through companies connected to Daniel. I stared at the pages. Why didn't Dad stop him? He did. Victor turned another page. This is where things get complicated. I saw a series of documents. Daniel had apparently persuaded my father to create a private investment structure called Redstone Holdings. Officially, Redstone was designed to purchase distressed commercial properties. Unofficially, Daniel had been using it to move money out of the company. But Dad had discovered it. And instead of confronting Daniel immediately, he did something I didn't understand. He let Daniel believe he had gotten away with it. Why? I asked. Victor's answer was quiet. Because your father wanted to know how far your brother would go. I looked at him. And Victor closed the folder. He went farther than your father expected. The room suddenly felt too small. What did he do? Victor hesitated. 8 years ago, your father discovered that Daniel wasn't just moving money. He slid one document toward me. He was preparing to take control of the company. I read the page. Daniel had been buying shares through intermediaries. Not enough to trigger attention, but enough to gradually build influence. Then came the part that made my hands go cold. There was a proposed agreement transferring controlling authority over several properties to a company connected to Daniel. My father had refused to sign it. 3 days later, the $1.75 million transfer had been made to Redstone. I looked up. Who authorized this? Victor said nothing. I already knew. Daniel. But there was something else. A handwritten note appeared at the bottom of the page. My father's handwriting. Let him think this money is gone. I looked at Victor. What does that mean? Victor reached into the folder again. This. He handed me another document. It was a trust agreement. I read the first page, then the second, then the third. My breathing slowed. My father had established a private trust 8 years earlier. The beneficiary wasn't Daniel. It was me. But the trust didn't contain $18 million. It contained something much more valuable. Control. If Daniel was ever found to have misappropriated company funds or fraudulently transferred assets, his inheritance could be challenged. My father had placed conditions on the estate. Daniel had received the money on the assumption that certain representations were true. If those representations were false, the distribution could be contested. I looked at Victor. Why didn't the attorney tell me? He couldn't. Why? Because your father specifically instructed him not to reveal the trust unless you discovered the watch. I leaned back. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. My father had known I would eventually find this. But he hadn't expected me to fight Daniel because I was angry. He wanted me to fight because I had finally understood the truth. I took the documents home. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called an attorney named Rebecca Shaw. She reviewed everything. For 3 hours, she asked questions. I answered them. She examined the bank records. Then she looked at me. Michael, I need you to understand something. What? This isn't about revenge. I know. No, I don't think you do. She tapped the folder. If these records are authentic, this is about recovering assets that may have been wrongfully transferred. I nodded. And Daniel? He may have legal exposure. That was all she said. No threats. No dramatic promises. Just facts. And somehow that made what came next feel even more serious. Rebecca sent preservation notices to the relevant institutions. She requested financial records. She contacted the estate attorney. She also told me not to confront Daniel. Let him talk, she said. About what? Everything. For the next 2 weeks, I said almost nothing. Daniel noticed. At first, he called me. Then he stopped. Then he began sending messages. You need to sign the remaining estate paperwork. I ignored him. Another message came. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I still didn't respond. Then he came to my house. It was a rainy Thursday evening. I opened the door. He stood on the porch wearing an expensive coat. Can I come in? No. He looked surprised. Michael, we're brothers. That hasn't always meant much to you. His jaw tightened. You've been talking to Victor. I said nothing. He stepped closer. You don't understand what you're getting into. I understand more than I did 2 weeks ago. His eyes hardened. Dad is dead. I know. So whatever happened before doesn't matter anymore. That sentence told me everything. I looked at him. Did you really believe that? He didn't answer. Instead, he said, you got the house. You got your memories. I got the responsibility of running the company. I almost laughed. Responsibility? Yes. You inherited $18 million. That money came with obligations. You mean Dad's business? Daniel shook his head. You always had a problem with me. No. I looked at him. I had a problem with watching you destroy things Dad spent his life building. His face changed. For a moment, the charming younger brother disappeared. What stood in front of me was someone angry and frightened. You think you're better than me? No. I stepped closer. I think you were given more chances than anyone deserves. He stared at me. Then he smiled. Not warmly. This isn't over. I know. He turned and walked away. I watched his car disappear down the street. Then I closed the door. 3 days later, Rebecca called. We found something. She emailed me a document. It was a private ledger from Redstone Holdings. The handwriting was Daniel's. Every transfer, every payment, every withdrawal, everything. And besides several of the larger transactions was one repeated notation. MC. My initials. I stared at the screen. What does that mean? Rebecca said, that's the problem. Someone had been creating records suggesting that I had authorized some of the transfers. I felt sick. Daniel wasn't just stealing. He had been preparing to blame me. I remembered the strange questions Dad had asked me months before he died. Where do you keep your important papers? Have you ever made a list of everything you own? He hadn't been preparing for his death. He had been preparing me for an attack. And then we found the final piece. A digital signature. It had been used on one of the transfer authorizations. But it wasn't mine. It had been copied from an old document. Someone had forged my authorization. Rebecca looked at me during our meeting. If this goes to court, Daniel is going to have a serious problem. I nodded. But I wasn't thinking about court. I was thinking about my father. Why had he never told me? Why had he carried all of this alone? Then Victor called. Michael, there's one more thing. What? Your father recorded a message. I froze. What kind of message? He left it with me. Why didn't you tell me? Because he instructed me to wait until the evidence was verified. When can I hear it? Tonight. We met at Victor's office. He placed an old digital recorder on the desk. Then he pressed play. My father's voice filled the room. It was weaker than I remembered, but unmistakably his. Michael. I closed my eyes. If you're hearing this, then you found the watch. I swallowed hard. I know you probably think I chose Daniel over you. My eyes opened. My father continued. I need you to understand that I didn't. There was a pause. I spent years believing I could fix your brother. That was my mistake. His voice cracked slightly. I kept giving him money because I thought eventually he'd understand what it meant to earn something. I looked down. I was wrong. Another pause. And I made another mistake. The recording continued. I protected you from the truth because I thought protecting you was love. I felt tears gathering in my eyes. It wasn't. My father took a breath. Love isn't always keeping someone away from pain. Sometimes love is trusting them enough to face it. I couldn't speak. If Daniel has done what I believe he has done, you'll have a choice. The recording paused. You can destroy him. I stared at the machine. Or you can stop him. My father's voice softened. Those are not the same thing. I wiped my face. Don't become the man you're fighting. The recording continued. Recover what belongs to the company. Protect the people who depend on it. And if you can, save whatever remains of your relationship with your brother. Then came his final words. But if he refuses to change, don't sacrifice yourself to keep the family together. The recording ended. The room was silent. I sat there for a long time. Then I understood the real inheritance my father had left me. It wasn't money. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a watch. It was the chance to choose who I would become after betrayal. The legal process began quietly. Bank records were reviewed. The suspicious transfers were traced. The forged documents were examined. The company board was notified. And eventually, Daniel was called into a meeting. He walked into the room, expecting another business discussion. Instead, he found Rebecca, Victor, the estate attorney, 3 board members, and me. Daniel stopped when he saw me. What is this? Rebecca opened a folder. We need to discuss several financial transactions. Daniel looked at me. You did this. I said nothing. Rebecca placed the first document on the table. This transfer was made through Redstone Holdings. Daniel shrugged. I don't remember. She placed another page beside it. Your signature appears here. He leaned forward. That could be anyone's. Rebecca placed the forensic report on the table. It's your signature. He looked at me. Then at the documents. This is ridiculous. Another folder opened. Then perhaps you'd like to explain this. The room became quiet. One transaction. Then another. Then another. The evidence accumulated. Daniel tried denial. Then confusion. Then excuses. Finally, anger. You're my brother. I looked at him. Yes. After everything I've been through, I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're asking me about everything you've been through. Yes. You've spent years taking from Dad. His eyes filled with anger. You think he loved you more? I didn't answer. He continued. He always thought you were the good son. I finally understood. This wasn't really about money. It had never been about money. Daniel had spent his entire life believing that everything I had earned was something I had been handed. He saw my father's trust as favoritism, my stability as luck, my quietness as weakness. And every time Dad rescued him, it only deepened the resentment. I looked at him. Dad didn't think I was better than you. Daniel stared at me. He thought you could become better than the person you were becoming. That broke something in him. His shoulders dropped. For the first time, he looked exhausted. The meeting ended without shouting. The consequences came afterward. Daniel lost control of Carter Development. Several assets were frozen pending investigation. The disputed transfers were recovered through settlement agreements. He was required to repay a substantial amount, and the forged documents became part of a formal investigation. But my father had been right about one thing. The hardest part wasn't defeating Daniel. It was deciding what to do after he had fallen. Months passed. I eventually became involved with the company, not because I wanted my father's empire. I didn't. I wanted to make sure the people who had worked for him for decades didn't pay for Daniel's mistakes. We sold some properties, paid outstanding obligations, protected employees, and rebuilt the company around something my father had always believed in: trust. As for Daniel, he moved to Arizona. For almost a year, we barely spoke. Then one afternoon, I received a letter. Not a text. Not an email. A letter. His handwriting looked strange to me. The first line said, "I finally understand why Dad left you the watch." I read the entire thing. Daniel didn't ask for money. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He didn't blame anyone. For the first time in his life, he admitted what he'd done. He said he had spent years believing that if he could get enough money, enough status, enough control, he would finally feel equal to me. But the more he took, the smaller he felt. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't answer immediately. A week later, I drove to Arizona. We met at a small diner. No lawyers. No accountants. No business documents. Just two brothers sitting across from each other. Daniel looked older. I probably did too. He stared at his coffee. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know. I don't even know if I deserve it. I thought about our childhood. Our father's construction sites. The yellow helmet. The old house. The arguments. The funerals. The $18 million. The broken watch. Finally, I said, forgiveness isn't pretending it didn't happen. Daniel nodded. I know. It means I don't want to spend the rest of my life carrying it. He looked up. Does that mean we're okay? I shook my head. No. He looked down again. But it means we can start being honest. That was enough. We didn't hug. We didn't make promises. We didn't pretend 20 years of resentment could disappear over coffee. But when I left that diner, I felt lighter. A year later, I repaired the watch. A local watchmaker told me the mechanism had never actually been damaged. My father had deliberately removed the internal movement and replaced it with a small compartment. The watch was never meant to tell time. It was meant to make me look closer. I put on my wrist. The hand still remained at 2:17. I could have had them fixed. I chose not to. Because every time I looked at that stopped watch, I remembered something my father had taught me when I was 12. Anyone can inherit something. Building something is different. My father had spent his life building a company. But in the end, his greatest unfinished project wasn't his business. It was his family. And maybe that's why he left me the broken watch. Not because I had received less, but because he knew I was the one who would stop long enough to ask why. I used to think my brother had inherited the millions, and I had inherited a broken watch. I was wrong. He inherited money. I inherited the truth. And the truth changed me more than $18 million ever could. Because money can tell you what someone owns. It can't tell you what someone is worth. Family can give you your deepest wounds. But it can also teach you where your boundaries need to be. And sometimes justice isn't about watching someone suffer. Sometimes justice is simply refusing to let someone else's choices destroy the person you are becoming. The watch still sits on my desk today. Stopped at 2:17. My father's final reminder that the most valuable things in life aren't always the things people fight over. Sometimes they're the things nobody recognizes until it's almost too late. And if you've ever been underestimated by your own family, if you've ever had someone mistake your patience for weakness, tell me in the comments. What would you have done if you were in my position? Would you have fought for the money? Walked away? Or tried to save the relationship after the betrayal? If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who may need to hear it. And subscribe to Father's Hidden Reckoning for more stories about family, betrayal, consequences, justice, and the moments when people finally discover their own worth.